like to start first of all with a little question for you to answer, which is to ask you a little bit about your online learning experience. So this will be two things. It'll give you a chance to use the interface, see if we can get it working. And the other is just to give us a little bit of a feel for how much you know about online learning. So, Bo, if you could put up the first poll question, please, which is something about online learning experience. Now, if you'd all like to have a go at clicking on that, we'll give you a minute to do that, and then we can see what results we get. I guess we ought to join in as well.
Yes, we should. Yes, yes.
I've studied, I've learned.
I haven't done that.
Taught online.
No, I have learned online informally. I haven't blended though. I haven't studied blended.
Okay, let's go with that. So has everyone managed to have a go at that?
So far, 9 out of 14 people have voted. Ten out of 14.
Okay.
Well, I guess that's probably taking away the presenters. That's probably good enough, I think. So
yeah.
Shall we have a look at the results? Right, that's great. So lots of people learning online informally. But it looks like Karen and I said we studied online. We're probably the only ones who've actually studied online, which is interesting. A couple of people have taught online. And again, it's probably Karen and I that said that we've written online course material. So that does look as though people have some experience of just learning online informally, but not in the context of a formal course where you get some credit at the end of it. And so which might be structured with, you know, assessment and exams and so on. So that's interesting because definitely what we're talking about today are those more formal credit-bearing sorts of courses and the quality assurance that's necessary to go with those. Well, great. Thank you very much for doing with that. Let's go back to the presentation and we'll dive in. While we're talking, please do, if you have questions that you think of, put them in the chat window. And if we get a chance, we'll pick them up as we're talking. And if not, we'll try and make sure we cover them by the end. I think we're planning to run this session for about 45 minutes and then give you a chance for a break. And then depending on how far we've got, we'll pick up again later. Okay, to start?
Let's go. Yeah.
Okay, right. So let's start with the first slide. We've done that, the poll. So generally, we're talking about quality in e-learning. And that's actually makes you think, well, actually, what do we mean by quality? And so again, I think I'd like to ask you if you have any ideas about what you think quality means. So here we've got a whiteboard. To respond to that, you need to find down on the bottom of the interface, there should be a choice of a little pen. If you click on that, you can change it to text. And if you click on the screen, you can type some thoughts. And if you do that, we should be able to see them. So please, everyone who's got a laptop there, do have a go and see if you can put in some ideas about I see Jan's put in John, Karen, but I can't see
going on
what else is going to say beyond that.
Move the chat window out of the way.
I'm not sure if I can.
You can.
No, it's just made it larger.
It just makes it bigger. Yeah. Okay, so have a go, everyone. It doesn't matter if you make a muddle of it or type something silly. It doesn't matter at all. It's just fun to see some things coming up on the screen, and it gives you an opportunity to see what this kind of online learning is like, as a person doing it, taking part in it.
If you're having trouble with the interface, and do type something in the chat window, and so we can see what the problem is. Students not able to write on the whiteboard. Oh no, dear. That's going to fool it.
Oh, is that no good, Bo? Is there anything we can do about that? Okay, well, never mind. At the moment, you can write into the chat window, which is just the same, really. So why not do that? Have a go at writing what you think into the chat window. Okay, I can see that Ellen and others are writing. That's good. Sometimes these chat windows are supposed to be instant, but they're not very quick sometimes. The system we have here at the Open University is very slow, and you just have to wait for people to type and type. Here we go.
I'm just going to get that note.
Yeah, a standard. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Achieve standard. So there's two people using the word standard. Goals and standards. Yeah, a good curriculum design. Okay, that's great. Purposeful. Excellent. Accountable. Okay, that relates to standards, I guess. Benchmarks is something we'll come on to later in the slide set.
A good course design, yes. So the interesting ideas of whether it comes out of design or whether it's something that you have to check afterwards.
Pleasant, yes, that's a nice one. Yes, enjoyable, why not?
Oh, learning enjoyable, who knows?
Differentiation.
That's an interesting one. Is that being able to differentiate between different students or different courses? Between students, right,
yeah. So that's linking to assessment there, which is very important.
Well, that's great. There's some nice ideas there. So yeah, some interesting perspectives. I put down, I think, some things, some thoughts that I had, which I think reflect some of the things that you've talked about. And one is a view of really about accreditation and compliance. In other words, it's a guarantee that a course that you study meets some minimum standard. And so that's particularly important for a degree or something like that, that there has to be some understanding that you reach a particular standard there. And accreditation, any formal accreditation process will feed into that. And more generally, you can see that as a little bit of a sort of consumer protection thing, particularly if you're going outside of formal education. The other thing is, of course, from the point of view of the institution that's delivering an online course, it's also about reputation as well. They want to be seen to be producing good courses, because that in return attracts good students. So the reputation of the institution is very important, maintaining that. And it's unfortunately true that if you recruit good students, it's much easier to produce good graduates at the end of it as well. So that's a good feedback loop to get into for many institutions. But the other thing is to think about it in terms of quality enhancement, about improvement. So particularly as a teacher, if you're interested in teaching online, then you want to make sure that you're doing a good job and to gradually improve your course. And so that's an important aspect. And again, the institution will probably have a say in that, because they want to make sure that materials improve over time. But actually, how that's thought about and measured can vary a lot between different institutions. So the Open University in the UK, one of the things that it prides itself on is being very open to anyone. So we will take students with no prior qualifications or anything like that. So people can come with any background. There's no sort of entrance exam in any sense. So anyone can sign up. And so that means you might be starting with students who have a very low educational status at one point. And so their gain over the course is what's very important, not necessarily where they end up. So we're doing the opposite of selective recruitment for good students. We're open to anyone. And the other thing is that we will pride ourselves on being open to students with various needs and disabilities and so on. And so that colors the sort of quality that you might be thinking about. So it's very important, if you're thinking about quality enhancement, that it's done in the context of the particular institution and what it sees its mission as. Okay, so that's some thoughts about quality, particularly when you think about QA in e-learning. There are a lot of different views over what that might mean, and there are often sort of tensions between it. So one is that difference between compliance is just, have you got to a particular level, or enhancement, which is about whatever level you're at, can you make it better? And the other one, which I think came out in what people were saying in the chat window, is do you focus on the process and what's actually going on? And that might be course design, curriculum design, pleasantness of the course, or the product, which is about achieving a certain standard at the end of it. And so that begins to make you think about what it is that you need to look at. Do you need to look at the input, what goes into the course, the curriculum design, the course design, the particular things that go to make up the course? Or should you look at the overall pedagogical model? Is there some way of teaching which works very well online that we should use? Or should you just look at the end? Just assess the students when they get to the end, or let the students assess the course, reflect back on the course. Those are outcome measures. And then whether to do self-assessment or have an external review. Approaches which are to do with scorecards. Have you done this? Have you done that? Or how does this compare with somebody else? Can you benchmark yourself against others? So there's a lot of different ways of approaching quality assurance in e-learning, which have been used in the past and continue to be used. I think if there is a consensus, it's actually that you have to take a really broad and holistic view, that it's really important to look at sorry, I've just had a warning coming up saying my computer will update in 29 minutes. So
we'll finish in 29 minutes.
So if everything goes horribly wrong, that's what's happened. Sorry, go back to holistic. That you need to think about both process, the context, in other words, what the institution's like and so on, as well as the output. So actually all aspects of that really need to be brought together to get a really good feel for quality. That's, I think, our position, and that's the E-xcellence position. And I think it's actually reasonably broadly accepted, but there are particular methodologies for QA that don't really do that. Right, that was enough of talking. Shall I move on a bit?
Yeah, so over to me for a little minute. So we're going to talk mainly in this session about a particular approach for quality enhancement in online learning, which is called E-xcellence or excellence. And it's been around for quite a number of years. So we'll just tell you a little bit about that. So moving through. So this is a label for quality in online learning, which can be gained by universities and other educational institutions via the European Association for Distance Teaching Universities. So you can see from this slide roughly what it's about. There is a manual which helps institutions to think about their quality approaches. And then there's various review processes which we'll go through. So I'll just move us on so that you can see a little bit more about what's involved in this excellence process. So excellence methodology, we sometimes call it. It was developed through some EU-funded projects over quite a long period of time. And nowadays, it's updated every few years. So we did an update of the manual in 2016. That was the 3rd edition of the manual. It uses a benchmarking approach. John mentioned that just now in his slide. And so it characterizes the aspects of e-learning that you would need to look at to improve quality into 35 different benchmarks. And these are grouped into 6 topic areas, which I'll tell you in a moment. Mention the manual. It's a little booklet which these days is delivered just online in a PDF. It used to be printed. And there's a quick scan tool which allows the people in the university to do a fairly quick self-assessment of all these different areas of their online courses. And then having done that and having taken part in a review with external assessors, then the university puts together a plan or a roadmap for how they're going to make improvements in the future. So that's roughly what happens in this excellence methodology. So I said that the processes were grouped, and this is the 6 groupings that there are. So they're explained a little bit on this slide. So starting at sort of a high level, so you're looking at the whole strategic approach to e-learning that university has. Then you're going down to how the curriculum in the particular area is designed and managed, the whole program that is, which is made up of many courses. Then you go down to the actual course level, and so you're looking at the detail really of how you teach a particular subject online. Then course delivery is about the practicalities and the technical aspects really of doing this. So making sure your computer is not going to update in 25 minutes when you're in the middle of a webinar, you know, that kind of thing really. So it's looking at the VLE, making sure that any technologies for doing teaching, webinars and so forth are up and available to students when they need them, and making sure everything is secure and private and all the things that it ought to be. And then these 2 last ones are about support for the people. So support for the staff who are doing the teaching and designing the courses, making sure they get the training that they need and that they're up to date with new developments and that they have enough time to do the work. And then supporting the students, so providing all the information that the students need, making sure the students understand all the different processes involved and that they're not feeling too isolated working at a distance from the university. So that area is particularly important. So moving on to the next slide. So we spoke about benchmarks. So here's an example of a benchmark, and this one's in the area of course design. So you can see that it's talking about learning outcomes, which I don't know what terminology you use when you're thinking about these things, but that's a way of specifying what you want to get from a particular aspect of a course, or what you want the learners to get from it. So the idea here is that you link the learning outcomes to the teaching methods and the material, so it's all appropriate. The other thing you link learning outcomes to is assessment, but we'll come on to that later. So that's an example of a benchmark. The idea is that you try and meet a good standard about that particular thing. So to help you with that, there are some indicators, which is just providing a little bit more detail about what's involved and what's important to think about. And these indicators come at 2 levels. There's a sort of a standard level, and there's what we call an excellence level. So all universities ought to be aiming at the standard level. And if you're ambitious or very experienced at online learning as an institution, then you ought to be aiming at the excellence level. Okay, so John's dealing with a question here. What is a VLE? You may call it a learning management system, possibly. And there's different terminology, but it's the environment within which the online learning takes place. So it typically includes delivery of the courses and possibly the assessment. It possibly provides facilities such as video conferencing. So it's a whole learning environment for the students and teachers to work within. Are there bad indicators? What a great question that is. I don't think we include any bad indicators, but I guess you could just inverse what there is there.
I think one point is that the indicators are always intended to be just a sample of what could be evidence. So the benchmark is a high-level statement of what you'd expect a good institution to be doing. But any particular institution, because it may teach in different ways or to different types of students, they might do it in very different ways. So these sample indicators are only just samples. And so they might be appropriate for your institution, but they may not. So it gives you the flexibility as anyone involved in this to say, actually, that's not really appropriate. We need something slightly different. So they could be bad because they might not fit to the way it's done in your particular institution, but they aren't a checklist. So it doesn't mean that you have to meet those indicators. You can do it differently. So in that case, there are no bad indicators.
Okay. Well, maybe we should make some up. Maybe that would be a good way of trying out something. Is that another topic for another workshop there?
Yes.
Yes. But Ellen had another really good question as well. So she says, what is the correlation between course and curriculum? And that's a good question. That's something I've muddled over and wondered over when I first came to work in this area. So I think, well, one answer to that is that the word curriculum is often, possibly usually used to talk about the whole of an area that someone is studying. So that can be made up of lots of courses. So one way to think about it is a curriculum can be expressed as a set of courses. So it may be that you cover different things in different courses. So it may be that one course needs to tackle things in a particular way so that the students have got the experience that they need of some approach. And another course it doesn't have to do that because it's been done once in that curriculum area and the students have got that experience. The other way is just to think about what does everybody need to know when they're studying a curriculum area such as education. You need to make sure that among all the courses, the whole area is covered to an adequate level. But an individual course is a bit more specialised, so it'll only cover one topic. So it's something like that, I think. John, is there anything you want to add?
Yes, terminology can be a bit muddled, can't it? I think often a curriculum equates to a qualification, the thing that you get out at the end of it with a name. I have a degree in zoology or something like that. Whereas a course is just one part of what you study in order to achieve that qualification. Sometimes the word course is used to mean the whole qualification, a degree, and you might talk about a module for part of that. But again, it's the terminology can vary between institutions.
Okay, so we'll move on. John's going to do a few slides now. So
right.
Okay.
Next.
Yeah.
Okay. So back to the idea of benchmarking again. So the point of benchmarking is it's a statement of best practice. It's what you think a really good institution would be doing in a particular area. And as we've seen, it's backed up by some suggested indicators, which don't have to be taken too literally. And the point of it is to measure what you're doing against good practice and see if you're meeting that good practice or even exceeding it, going a bit beyond it. So that means thinking about what evidence you've got for your benchmark, and as we discussed with the indicators, that can be different in different universities. So we hope that all the benchmark statements are broad enough that everyone should be able to recognize them, but the particular evidence would be very different in a different university, because they would have different approaches and maybe different across different courses as well. So taking it as a whole, it gives you an indication of where the institution or the course has strong points and where it's got weaknesses, and that should then lead you to an idea of what you can do to improve. That's the quality enhancement that comes in, and the way that's formalized should be in a roadmap of actions that are going to improve over the next 3 years, 5 years, that sort of time scale. So just to talk a little bit about the way that's been done in E-xcellence, they've emerged out of these projects over a number of years. They've ended up, we think, quite generic in form, so that the trouble about e-learning is it dates very quickly. You know, there's some new thing on the block that everything, you know, it's very trendy this year, and then 2 years later it's beginning to seem dated. So we've tried to make the benchmarks quite generic so that they're always useful, no matter how technology and pedagogy has changed. So we've got a couple of questions there about how you choose between a benchmark and an indicator. So that's one of the differentiations, is the benchmark should be quite generic and not talk about detail, but the indicators can be much more detailed. And so they're the ones that could date or that might not be appropriate in a different setting.
And then asked about criteria as well.
If by criteria you mean, you know, does a course have to do a particular thing, then no, the whole approach tries to avoid that. Sorry, just getting a nag about having to reboot, which I'm hoping
16 minutes. Well, that could be in the gap.
Sorry. In that sense, we don't use a scorecard or a criteria basis. Deciding what's an indicator or a benchmark comes out of discussion with the people involved in developing E-xcellence. So that's how we've built them up over the years. There's been a group of people involved, and every time we do a review, there's an opportunity to get feedback on the process, and so improve the process itself. But yeah, good questions about selecting a benchmark. It can be difficult, and there can be different views about it. There's usually good discussion, I think, about what makes a benchmark. Right. Another good question then: who are the people who? What is their background? Do they stay the same group? Interesting. Yeah. The focus has been through EADTU. That's the European Association of Distance Teaching Universities. So that is a subset of universities, but they include the open distance educations, which can be the large institutions in different countries, who came from a background of people with a lot of experience in distance education, kind of before e-learning became common. So we like to think that we have a good experience and good background in that. So that's the sort of general thing. And who are people? They've a community that's developed and evolved, I think is probably the best way that can be said. They've not stayed exactly the same. People have dropped out and other people have come in. Overall, there's been a dozen, 15, 20 involved over a period of time.
There's quite a lot of consistency. We're just talking about the excellence approach, of course. There are many other approaches to quality assessment and enhancement in online learning throughout the world. So different sets of people are involved in those. So excellence is just one example, but it's the main European one. Okay, should we move
on? Yes. Okay. Let's carry on. Right. Okay. So I've talked a couple of times about benchmarks, and then needing, when you're doing a review using E-xcellence, about collecting evidence and demonstrating that you meet a particular benchmark. So, Bo, can we switch to a poll then? And who do you think should be the people that should collect that evidence and bring it to a review? So we've got the course author, an administrator, students, external reviewer, and possibly other people. And this is one way you can click more than one. If you have any other ideas, do put them in the chat window.
What do you think is going to happen about this?
I think I've quit from PowerPoint, which was the only other thing I had open.
Yeah. I want to close this thing down now.
I'm hoping we'll be okay.
Should we do this, Paul?
Maybe I'll stay out of it.
Yeah.
You have 9.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, that's okay. Let's go with it.
Yeah.
Right. Let's have a look, see what people have said. So external reviewer seems to be important, and that always gives you some kind of cross correlation, so that that external brings in an external viewpoint and knows about the broader landscape. But actually, an external reviewer won't know the detail. It's very difficult for an external reviewer sometimes to squirrel in and find the detail of any particular course. So sometimes they're really not the most efficient way of gathering evidence. So actually, probably the evidence should come from inside the institution, and the external reviewer gives a check on that. So students are very important. I think it's a very important voice to make sure that the student voice is heard in that, because they understand what it actually feels like. And a couple of times we've done reviews where you're talking to the staff and then you talk to the students, and you actually get quite a different picture, because the staff have provided something and actually the students aren't using it. So it's very important that the students are in there. And obviously a course author should know what they're doing intimately, so they are in a very good position to say exactly what they're doing. Administrator, actually quite often, because this is seen as a bit of a chore, I think quality assurance is put into a separate part of the university sometimes, and sometimes that ends up as being more of an administrator. And I always feel slightly uncomfortable there, because they may not understand the experience of a particular course. On the other hand, they may have a very good broad overview of what the university does. All right, there's an interesting suggestion there. Would it not be nice to have educational researchers collect the evidence? Are they not most qualified? Yeah, that's a really nice idea, isn't it? Of course, that's quite a lot of effort for an educational researcher to collect that evidence. We could talk about IET.
Yeah, we've got at this university we have a whole department that specialises in educational technology, and they do a lot of research. They do some teaching development work as well. So we do have people like that. They're not directly involved in excellence at present, though they are involved in other projects to do with e-learning quality. So they are doing that kind of work. I suppose a comment I would add here is that to a degree, the people who are the excellence reviewers are educational researchers, because they do educational research back in their own institutions. So they have the knowledge and the expertise to make assessments of what's going on. But yeah, educational researchers from the institution, but why not? If you've got them and they're willing, that would be great.
The other point is that the institution may have a sort of a method for regularly evaluating their courses, and so that's part of an institutional educational research effort that might be sort of wired into the whole institution, and particularly for institutions that came from a distance teaching or online, that's a very obvious thing to do, and perhaps not quite so much for traditional face-to-face universities. But I think now everyone is doing some evaluation, continual evaluation of courses. So that is part of the evidence that should feed into this anyway, and that's normally done by a survey department or something, which might be the same people who do educational research, but it might not.
And the other people who it's very important to have providing evidence for the review are the senior management of the university, because they ought to and do have an idea of what they're trying to achieve through the e-learning. So it's important to at least speak to them as part of a review. And then sort of at the other end of the scale, in some sense, the people who look after the technology can make a major contribution to the review and really give the reviewers the confidence that the technology is working as it should do, and the students are being properly supported in what they need to do. And very often there's some very, very good practice goes on in that category of staff, so that gives you a lot of confidence that everything's as it should be.
I think the take-home message really is that you need a very wide range of people contributing to a review. It needs to have all the stakeholders, and they can be a very broad set of people involved. So an ideal review brings in a lot of information from a lot of different places. Great, thank you very much for that. Let's move on to another slide then, please, Bo. Thank you. So we've talked a little about E-xcellence now, but actually it can be used in a variety of different ways. So the material is all there on the website. It's based around the manual, which includes the benchmarks and indicators. So it's possible for an individual or an institution to use an informal approach by just going through it using something we call a quick scan, which is an online version or a paper version, which just lets you say, do we meet this or not? And so it's a quick rating against the different benchmarks. And so that's an informal way of doing it. You can then move up a state and include all the different stakeholders and start to collect the evidence so that you've got data to back up what you're asserting about whether we are or are not meeting a benchmark. And so that can be done as an internal self-assessment, and which can lead on to thinking about what you're going to do to improve. And that can be integrated into existing institutional processes. So often there may be data gathering going on anyway, and so that can be brought into it. One of the things that we haven't really said about E-xcellence was that there was, at the time when universities were moving into e-learning, there was a feeling that the institutional processes that existed were fine for face-to-face teaching, but were really often very inappropriate for online learning. So E-xcellence was really positioned as a way to kind of fill that gap between existing quality assurance, which was going on in universities anyway, but was not appropriate for online learning. So it was always intended to sort of plug that gap. As more universities have moved towards online learning and to blended learning, it's, I think, colored it a little bit differently, because now it needs to catch a sort of broader aspect. But still, that idea that you can integrate it with what else is happening anyway is very important. Just to mention then, the final thing is that if you want to win the label, to get recognition, then you have to go through those steps of self-assessment, producing a roadmap, and then having an external review as well. And once you go through that and reports produced and so on, that leads to official recognition by EADTU, and then there's a badge that the institution can put on the course, on the website, whatever, to say that it's met all these process statements. So we have a couple of questions that come in through the chat. Working with benchmarks is a choice that was made. Why did we choose benchmarks, and are there other options we considered? The approach started as a benchmarking approach, and so that was really, I think, one of the things that led the whole approach. So the people who were involved in the early days thought that that was going to be a good way of doing it, because it meant tracking the leading institutions that were doing e-learning well at a time when there wasn't really a broad understanding of what good e-learning was like. So benchmarking is a good way of tracking a changing field because it keeps you up with the leaders. And so one of the initial E-xcellence projects did a very systematic benchmarking process. We went around a number of different institutions, and that provided the initial benchmark statements. Is there recognition of the E-xcellence label by international accreditation or organizations? Yes and no. Accreditation can vary by country, and E-xcellence is a European-wide thing, so it kind of sits differently in different countries. That's one issue. And accreditation in some countries is very much aligned to subject topics rather than methods of teaching. So sometimes it's a little bit at odds to it, which again is why it's valuable as a supplement to accreditation. It does dovetail into the European standards and guidelines, which is the part of the Bologna process that talks about what quality assurance should be like in all higher education institutions across Europe. So it does dovetail quite well with that, but it's not a formal link between it. Both put up the link there, which is useful. Actually, I think there was a question earlier which we missed about links. I hope that provides the links.
Oh, that was what it meant. Yeah, so I thought it meant link between curriculum and courses. Yeah, thank you, Bo. Yeah.
Shall I move on? Any other questions for the moment, or shall I carry on? We have about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll need to take a break anyway. Okay, I'll plow ahead and see if we can come on. So I've mentioned the idea of a review to win the label, to be awarded the label, and this gives you a sense of what it's like. We've talked about the need for having a cross-disciplinary team, getting lots of stakeholders involved, to discuss amongst themselves and do a self-assessment against the benchmarks, using the quick scan tool as a starting point. And then you can have the external review. So that's the point at which the external experts come in, look at what's been prepared, usually over either a face-to-face or an online meeting, have discussed with those group of stakeholders, and then the internal team will go back, think about what's been presented, and develop and present a roadmap. They may have already done a draft already, but to finalize that draft. And then the reviewers will be sitting there writing a report which considers those two things together. And assuming everything is fine, that leads to this recognition being by EADTU.
And the reviewers, just to add in, will most likely make some recommendations or draw some conclusions, which then the institution can think about to see if they want to act on those in the future, possibly modify their roadmap, or just possibly bear it in mind for future planning.
And a good question about whether the experts are the reviewers or a broader group. No, for any particular review, usually involves 2, 3, or 4 people involved, and they will be the reviewers, and they are E-xcellence experts, so they have experience of using the methodology. So they will not be subject domain experts, but they will have that broad experience of online learning that we've talked about. Okay, where are we generally?
Quick scan, just run through that. Just quick.
Oh, quick scan I mentioned, which is a way of doing a self-assessment. There is an online tool, which I'm not sure is operating at the moment, but it just lists the benchmarks and lets you do on a quick scale whether you think that the institution is meeting that particular benchmark is excellent in all respects, or adequate, or not adequate. And so it's just a quick way of doing a rating. And it's a starting point for a self-assessment review.
And then typically people will write at the university, they'll write some notes, won't they, about that particular topic that little quick scan question is asking about. So they might judge it as in need of improvement, and then they will explain, what they think could be improved. So it's quite an open process, really, this whole thing.
I'm conscious of the time. It's
pause
10 to 10. Jan, did you think that we should take a break at this point, because I think you needed to change rooms or something? And then we can start the case study, which will take a little bit of time if we after a break.
So there's a natural break here in the slide set, as it were.
While you think about that, Alan's come up with an interesting question. Do you review institutions periodically after receiving the label? Yes, the answer to that is yes. It should be 3 years after. They should need to renew the label if they want to maintain it. So that does happen periodically. And the renewal can be a little bit lighter touch, and we've done those online, having had a face-to-face on the initial one. We can spend 2 days at the institution and really get into it. The renewal can be a little bit lighter touch because you should know more of the background, and could do that in an online meeting in a day. Right, Jan's saying we can have the break here.
Okay, so shall we start again at...
do you want to give us a time?
Yeah, would it be 10 o'clock your time? What's 10 o'clock our time? 11 o'clock then.
10 minutes, 15 minutes? Okay.
Okay then, yeah. See you later. Right.
Right.
Get a coffee.
Drink the coffee.
Put the mic on.
Maar ik zeg dat we klaar zijn.
Yeah, are we putting video? Oh, we're on. I can't call you, I thought. Do you want to move this way?
Hello, we're back. And Jan says we're ready, so looks like we're good to go. Is that okay with everyone?
Okay, thank you, Ron. Thank you, John.
Right, Ellen's starting us immediately with a question. For me, it's still not clear what makes a benchmark a benchmark. Do you look at leading institutions and find them, or how does that work? Because I believe you said it's a good way to track a changing field. Yes, the way E-xcellence started was with a systematic benchmarking exercise that went out and looked at a number of different institutions. More recently, when we've been doing the updating, it's been a matter of getting people together and drawing on their individual experiences to find out what's new, what's changing, what's interesting. So it's not quite the benchmarking in that formal sense of actually having measured against particular institutions. That's how it started, but it's moved a little bit away from that. So we are trying to catch newer developments when we do the updates every few years. Do the universities have to reach all of the benchmarks to deserve the label? No. The most important criteria is that they have taken stock of where they are and have developed a roadmap in order to improve. So that's the most important thing. So they don't have to have scored necessarily at the top level for all of them. I think if an institution had seemed to be doing very badly on everything, then the recommendation would be that they shouldn't achieve the label. But it's more about engagement with the process and showing a trajectory, a way of changing over time. So again, this does distinguish E-xcellence from some of the other systems of QA which are out there, which are all about reaching a standard, reaching a minimum standard. And E-xcellence does take a different approach. It's not about a checklist to see whether you've got somewhere. It's about are you engaging seriously with quality enhancement, and do you have a trajectory that's going to improve over the coming years?
So just to illustrate that a little bit, so in the reviews that John and I have done, and we've done a number between us over the years, typically a university might assess some of the benchmarks, or even most of them, but not all of them, as excellent, the top grade. Sometimes they will drop down a grade. Sometimes, if there's a particular area that they are aware of that is a problem for them, then they'll say this is basically not adequate. So it varies quite a lot, and hopefully in this case study that will come through a little bit. But it's certainly not the case that the people gaining the label have got excellent for everything. In fact, if they did, that you might be rather suspicious of that, to be honest, because everyone has the opportunity to improve and the need to improve, and that's what the purpose of this is, to make improvements and to aim at the highest level, but to know what you need to change to move towards that high level. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so we have, well, we're calling it a case study, so just some examples of what a university has done to look at these benchmarks and to work through these in relation to their own context. So we've chosen a few benchmarks, and we're going to give you some extracts from the self-assessments that this university made against these benchmarks, but we'd like to involve you in a little bit of activity as well. So here is one example benchmark, which is about personalizing courses and curricula to the students as far as possible and giving the students some flexibility. So this is where we're asking the university to assess the extent to which they offer some levels of personalisation and flexibility for learners, while making sure that the standards are adequate and that the learning outcomes are actually met. So can you think of any examples of flexibility that can be offered in an e-learning context, or personalisation for individual students? So probably, did we just decide that the whiteboard worked?
No, use the chat
Yeah,
window.
so if you want to just type into the chat window, and we'll see what people think about this.
You can reflect on your own experience if you of learning where you've had flexibility and personalization.
Yeah, some nice ideas coming through. Okay, well, that's a good selection there. A very good selection.
Yeah. If I can make a comment, I think one thing it shows is that there can be a difference between a sort of macro level and micro level. So modular courses and choices of courses work at a very large level. So you might be doing a curriculum that offers some choice in it, but not complete choice. But when you look at the material at a much more micro level, it's about whether every student does every exercise, or whether there's the possibility of customizing it for each individual, maybe learning styles, maybe prior background knowledge. And timing and pace is another one, which is of course, one of the opportunities of e-learning is it's intrinsically more flexible in terms of the pace and timing of learning.
Yeah, a few of the things that were mentioned here by you are a bit related to quite modern technical approaches using artificial intelligence. So exercises adapted to prior knowledge. You might have a system that was able to judge where a student needed to go next in their learning, or what sort of assessment would be best for them, giving them things that are a little bit harder or a little bit easier, depending on how they've performed so far. So some of this can be quite advanced. Some of it can simply be the design of what you're offering to the students in terms of how many different courses there are. Do they get much choice? Can they do it in their own time, or are they on a bit of a timetable that they have to meet? So yeah, I think you've covered all the important points there. Well done. So let's move on. So here's a quotation. I'll just let you read this in your own time from the university that we're talking about for this case study, about what they offered for flexibility and choice and personalization. So you can probably see that this is really at the macro level that John described. So there are choices in what courses to study. There are choices in what order to study those courses. but there isn't very much currently of the personalisation at a fine-grained level of what's in the actual course. And so there's no adaptation of the course to the person. So that might be something for the future for this university.
It's
John?
worth pointing out that this is one that the institution has scored as adequate, but not excellent by any means. So they are acknowledging that there's work that they could do to improve.
Okay, right. So that's one of the benchmarks.
We see the roadmap actually now.
So this is now what the university have written about what their plans are in relation to this area, this benchmark. So again, I'll let you just read that in your own time. So you can probably see that this university is thinking about more and different kinds of macro level flexibility. So more opportunities for students to start their courses at different times that suit their own schedule. This is partly because this is a distance learning university and the students are in paid employment. So flexibility of that kind is very important. Possibly different sizes of courses, again, to provide that flexibility to fit into the working life. But there isn't really anything written down there about this micro level personalisation at the level of elements within a course. So it's possible that this university thinks that's too speculative and too advanced to consider, you know, in the next year or two, but maybe in the future they would.
We have a couple of questions come in. One is what would be excellent? Again, I think I'm probably sounding like I'm repeating myself, but there is no definition of excellence for any of these. It's a matter of sort of consideration and review and reflection back to decide what is it that we're doing, what can we improve. So it's not, there isn't ever a set excellent. It's up to the university to decide what it is that they're doing, whether they think it's meeting the needs of their particular students and whether they can improve.
But there are indicators at excellence level.
There are certainly indicators there which come out of the benchmarking exercise. There should be one up there somewhere.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to avoid the suggestion that there is a gold standard which you can say I've definitely met that. It's about a judgment against where you are and where you can go. Interesting about the case of too much personalization and flexibility, particularly when we're talking about this sort of large level thing. It's also about balancing the needs of an accreditation approach, which says you've got to have done this, got to have done that, got to have done this, with flexibility and choice. So a curriculum that was too flexible and personalized could end up with the student being able to weave their way around and not having touched all the learning outcomes for the course, which would be a problem for accreditation. So there's always a job to be done to make sure that the students are meeting all the learning outcomes, and that can mean restricting personalization and flexibility.
So Joke says, can you give an example of an important indicator? We could, but you can have a look yourselves as well, because the manual is there online and it's, you know, freely available. You don't have to sign in or pay or anything like that to have a look at it. So you can see there that the indicators are at these two levels. So that might answer that question about what would be excellent level as well.
And remember, an institution can decide that the indicators in the manual aren't appropriate to them and write their own. You know, it's just a matter of what evidence that they have and whether they're confident that that's a good evidence that they are meeting the overall benchmark. Okay.
So we'll now go on to a different benchmark here, and this is about developing teaching materials, online teaching materials, and making sure these are reviewed by people with appropriate expertise to make sure that the teaching material is at a high standard and is good teaching. So here we're saying that these are reviewed by different kinds of people. So who do you think those people might be? Who do you think the stakeholders who could be involved in reviewing the quality of teaching materials would be? So if you like to use the chat window again. Questions lined up.
Pick it up at the end, I think maybe that. Karen, who do we think the stakeholders are?
I'm not going to tell you yet. Field experts, that's an interesting one. Teachers from other institutions.
Don't want me, actually. Do you want me to?
Yeah, do take it over, yeah.
Okay, I'll try and pick up then what's been offered in the chat window. There was a general question which I'll park for a minute and come back to it. But particularly about stakeholders, we got suggestions that it should be the students and the teachers. Obviously, they're the most important people involved with the particular course, so their views are very important. Having an educational expert standing back a little bit and able to give a more overall view of how the pedagogy works and so on, that's a very good suggestion as well. Field experts, by which I think you mean the sort of domain, so something about the topic. I think that's important as well, and often we would have an external assessor or something who is related to the particular domain field. And there may well be accreditation standards or subject benchmarks as well that are useful in that that area as well. Teachers from other institutions, yes, possibly. I'm not sure whether that happens commonly, except as part of an external review.
Well, yeah, our courses, when we develop them here, we always have an external assessor when the course is being developed who has to sign it off really before it's put out there. And then when the course is being run, we have, and all UK universities have this, external examiners who make sure the course is being run properly, and in particular that the assessment, the exams and assignments in the course are appropriately marked, the general standard of the students, that kind of thing. So there are definitely teachers from our educators from other universities involved.
Yeah, I should say that that's part of the normal quality assurance process that underpins the UK university. Certainly, that happens across the nations. What is an external examiner? We're not familiar with this, right? So when at the end of a course, when the students have done all their work and done their exams, and all the results come in, then there would normally be an exam board which will sit and decide the final results that a student will get, and that can be at for a course that's modular, it would be at a module level, and then also at maybe at the end of the whole qualification. And there will always be an external examiner. That means there is, as Karen said, a representative from a different institution to make sure that the standards that are being applied are consistent across the university, so across institutions. So an external examiner is a very important role. And as I say, that does apply to UK universities generally, that there will always be somebody there.
So that enables you to claim as a university that your courses and your qualifications are equivalent to those elsewhere at other universities, which is very important, because you don't want people thinking that the standards at your university are not high enough. And you can say, well, they are high enough because we've had people from other universities involved, and they've seen what we do, they've seen what the students' work is like, and they've seen what the assessment materials are like.
So there are really two important external inputs, formal inputs. There is when the course is being designed and before it's offered, there will be external input at that point, and then every presentation there will be the external examiner who will be able to look at the work that the students are actually doing, at their exam results and so on. I should say that the UK quality assurance landscape is probably different from other parts of Europe, in that universities have a lot of autonomy on how they award degrees and so on. And so the role of the National Quality Assurance Agency is a bit different in the UK compared to other countries. And so the external examiner may be doing some of the jobs that the a national quality assurance agency might be doing. So there's a little bit of a different landscape in the UK. Yes, sorry, let's move on. So just to go back to this particular example, I'll let you read that. This is what the university said it did and how it did it. So just to give a bit of context to this, I think what you can see here is that, remembering we're talking about E-xcellence is about online learning, but actually a lot of what's going on here is part of the standard quality assurance process that applies to the whole university. It's just part of what happens as normal business. So there is a whole mechanism of annual reviews, board of studies, and so on, which is there to make sure that material is always reviewed and kept up to date. So there are annual reviews. There's a post-launch review immediately after the course is presented for the first time. There's one that happens mid-life during the planned life of a module to make sure that it's still current, and so on. So there are those things which are part of the larger quality assurance that goes on in the university as a whole. There are some aspects which are probably a little bit more appropriate to e-learning, and that's the mention of live data and evidence-based decision making. They're the sorts of things that can happen because you're doing online learning. So you begin to get learning analytics data, which can inform the module team who's presenting the course during the course presentation of things that are maybe not working quite so well, and so on. But there's an acknowledgement at the end that actually it's not quite as agile as you might want. So there's, in this particular case, there are some quite complex structures that need to be worked around. So actually there's a constraint on freedom for changing things. I'm going to go on and just show you what was said about change. Just to mention again that we've picked one which is only rated as adequate, although there's some examples of excellent performance. So again, it's not saying that anything's brilliant, and so therefore there are opportunities to improve, and this is what was said about what could be done better. TEL implementations, that means technology enhanced learning in this case. So I'm sorry, there's quite a lot of detail there to read, but I think the things to pick out there is that there's an acknowledgement and a mechanism for using students in a quite considered way. So this student panel of people who volunteered to test and provide, look at prototypes, look at early drafts of things, or to look at reviews. And so it's a way of making sure that the material is actually good and fit for purpose before it's offered to the larger cohort of students. So it's a way of getting students involved actually in the course development really early on, to improve that review before first presentation. And the other is an opportunity to use real-time analytics. So these are things that are coming from the fact that it is an online learning experience. So effectively the website, the virtual learning environment, is tracking clicks, and that gives you information about where students are engaging with it, how long they're spending, whether there are issues there. So this is part of the promise of learning analytics that should come through over the next few years.
Okay.
Okay, if there are any questions on that, please do type in. Otherwise, we'll jump on to another benchmark.
Okay, so back to me. So this one is one from the student support area, and it's to do with using social media, which is interpreted quite broadly in the E-xcellence framework. So here we have a benchmark which asks the university whether they're using social media to help build communities, online communities with the students. And they could be doing that within their own VLE, virtual learning environment, or learning management system through, for example, discussion forums, or they could be using external social media such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, I guess. So I've just given a few examples of social media. Which ones would you choose if you were a teacher thinking about trying to build a community of e-learning students for your course or your curriculum? Try typing into the chat window and we'll see what people think.
Question?
Yeah, come on to that one, yeah.
I'll just mention that there's another good general question that's come up, but actually we have some slides to address it in a minute, so we'll park that one as well.
So Ellen was asking which benchmark tends to come up with the most good quality or the most problems. So you'll see in a bit. Okay, so here's the idea of using an internal forum, so we can discuss that shortly.
The suggestion of Facebook there, making it popular and reaching a lot of people.
And then we've got a chat group, so that can mean real-time chat, synchronous chat, where you're typing in and it's happening on the screen as you do it, like we are using now. Ah, influencers. Wow, there's an idea.
Right, should we go with?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, feel free to keep typing things in, but we'll move along. So that raises some quite interesting questions about, do you use facilities that are within the university, or do you go out into the wider world of social media and so forth? Okay, some people have come up with some other platforms. I haven't come across those before, but yeah, there's lots of things out there that can be used. So let's see what this university said about this benchmark in their quick scan. So here we are. They flagged it as adequate with some examples of excellence, and I'll leave you to read those for a moment. Okay, so you can see from what they've written that there's quite a mix of different things that are used. So the main courses would use forums within the virtual learning environment, and also would use a system called Adobe Connect, which is a webinar type system, very similar to what we're using now. And all of those things are looked after by the teaching staff. But in addition to that, there's a whole spectrum of different users of different kinds of social media, mostly for engaging students with the university rather than for formal teaching. But there is some use of social media for library and more teaching focused activities, and in connection with the university's open educational resources. Okay, so let's have a look at what the plans for the future were in relation to this. So we've just anonymized this here with the XXX. So that's quite a brief plan of action, really. And it's just focusing on one particular social media, which clearly the people who wrote this thought was an opportunity for them, something that was popular, Instagram. So again, that's an extension of engagement, really, to try and get students to realise what happens, within the university and how their courses are developed and that kind of thing. So it's not really related to teaching, it's more related to kind of bringing people in and getting them to feel part of the university that we're talking about here.
Some of that is addressing the kind of loneliness of a distance student. So online learning can be a very solitary experience, and so social media gives you an opportunity to let students feel a sense of being an academic in an academic community, being a student, part of a student body, and sharing their interests across disciplines. So I think many of those things do address that need. A question there about reaching lower classes if they have no social media. Yes, questions of inclusion and exclusion are always an issue, aren't they? I feel that people are generally, I don't see that as a huge barrier myself.
Well, it's a barrier to the whole of e-learning, isn't it? If someone can't afford a computer, they can't do it.
I mean, so given that you have to take it as a prerequisite that the student has access to the internet, then I think that it's not. I don't see that sort of cost is the barrier to that. But a lot of people have very different views on whether they wish to be active in a social media environment or not. So it always seems to me is something that's quite hard to integrate into an absolutely compulsory part of study experience and learning. So at the moment, it seems to be much more sit around the edges and more optional thing. But for instance, a VLE forum, if they have access to the VLE material for their learning, then they will have access to the forum. There should be no barrier there.
So Sarah's asking, is this plan of action insufficient in order to deserve a label? I think in the philosophy of the excellence, where we're identifying problems and thinking about them and making some plans, there wouldn't be a problem in gaining the label, but it's quite likely that the reviewers would have fed back to the people who are doing their self-assessment, possibly to saying, have you thought about something a bit wider than this? And it may be that the roadmap would then be modified to broaden that out a little bit. So it's a valid question, Sarah. Thank you.
Yeah, I should say that this is an extract anyway, so there may have been more comments there as well. So yes, the label is based on what the universities undertake in order to improve. Yes, the roadmap that they produce is a very important part of the document, and that's part of the judgment about what they need to do.
Yeah, so we often describe excellence as a quality enhancement approach, which is definitely the case. So it's not trying to say what your quality is at the moment. It's trying to say, have you got an outlook where that quality is going to improve and continue to improve in the future? So that's the end of that little case study of one university. Oh yeah, one more question.
What if they're already very good? Is there always the possibility to improve on every aspect? I'm sure there is. Yeah, I'm sure there is. And often the good institutions are the ones who have the really innovative ideas. So I think we're a long way off nirvana for e-learning. It can be difficult for people, and I don't think actually, taken broadly, nobody knows the perfect recipe for doing e-learning. So even the institutions that are doing it well, I think there is still a lot of room for improvement. So I don't see that as a problem at the moment at all.
And that nicely takes us on to the next section, which is a little bit of research that John and I have done on the data from some excellence reviews over a period of 10 years. So this will give you a bit more of an idea of which areas are, already very good, and which areas are possibilities for improvement. So, okay, do you want to go on?
And it relates back to, there was an earlier question about what areas are difficult. So over to you. Which one do you think would result in most action? So we've done a lot of reviews, a lot of different institutions. Where do you think it might be that there would be the most room for improvement? So we're asking here at the very high level: strategic management, curriculum design, course delivery, staff support, student support. We can go into a bit more detail in a minute. But just have a feel for what you think might be where there is the most scope for improvement. No? I probably did.
Mm-hmm. Let us know, Bo, when we've got about 9-ish answers. Here we go. Right, let's see what people thought. Okay. So it looks like course design is coming out most. And then others quite similar. Student support also another important one. Okay. So
we didn't actually put a slide in which shows what we actually found, but I think that does actually reflect reasonably well the sorts of concerns. But I think strategic management came out rather higher than we've got there. Yeah. But student support is definitely an area that institutions focus on, and I think course delivery is not so problematic these days. I think if you'd asked that question 10 years ago or 15 years ago, there would have been more.
Yeah, I've always been quite really pleasantly surprised at how the quality on the course delivery, so the technical side, has always been very, very strong. So that's reassuring. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide in this little section. So I think we've covered that one. We'll just zip forward. Yeah. So now that going down into a little bit more detail now. So here you've got a quite a short sort of summary of all the different benchmarks. So going down, delving down into a little bit more detail now, can you indicate any of these that you think would be ones where universities would want to make improvements, you know, because they've identified more problems?
We were going to do this as a whiteboard where you just make marks on it. So I don't know whether people can do that if it's just, it looks like it's just us at the moment who are able to do that. But if you do see the pen and you can click on it and then make a mark, then do it.
Otherwise, just type the numbers into the chat window.
Yeah, just, yeah. If you see anything that you think could be problematic, then just type the number in the chat window and we'll have a look. We'll just give it a minute or two to do that. I'm afraid it's a bit difficult without being able to use the whiteboard.
So quite a few people focused on course design in the last poll. So you might want to look at the benchmarks there and see which ones you think.
I'm afraid they're quite abbreviated there, so it might not be obvious what they mean. But I don't think we need to go through them all in detail.
The student support area was one that people identified as well. I think the benchmarks there is pretty obvious what they mean.
Looks like we're not getting anyone really able to offer anything. We'll just wait a minute longer in case anyone does want to chip in. Oh, there we are.
Right.
Oh yeah, some numbers coming in now.
Different numbers. Two people saying 14.
Which is interactivity.
Okay, good.
So yeah, interactive stuff. Number 4, integrated systems. Yeah, and by integrated systems, that often means making sure that there's a nice seamless journey from the student between registration and study, so that they're not having to deal with multiple different systems. What else have we got?
There's quite a bit about assessment in Ellen's list of numbers, I think.
E-learning strategy I've seen come up. 29 is workload management for staff. Yes, that is actually quite an important one. 17, assessment. 15, self-assessment feedback. Yeah. 26, staff training.
Right.
Another one for assessment there. An e-learning strategy I've seen as well come up a couple of times. And overall, that's a sort of strategic thing about the institutional approach. 110.14, that's e-learning strategy, learning outcomes and constructive alignment. That was the benchmark we showed earlier on, I think, which is making sure that learning outcomes are aligned. Given a learning outcome, how do you teach it and how do you assess it should all line up together. 32, student guidelines. Well, great. There's some really interesting things that come out of that. Shall we?
Yeah. So we'll now go. We're going to show you a bit of data that came from looking at quite a few different reviews. So this was our little research project that we did. So we wanted to do what we're talking about here now, to find out which aspects of the e-learning or blended learning needed the most improvement, or universities wanted to improve the most. So we looked at data from 19 different excellence reviews over the years across Europe between that period of 2009 and 2016. And then we counted basically which of the benchmarks had the most areas where the universities wanted to make improvements, so had one or more actions in their roadmap. So let's have a look eventually at the data from this. So this is nicely color coded into the six areas. You can see starting at strategic management at the top, curriculum design and so forth. And then the individual benchmarks are shown there. And you can see the size of the column against each benchmark is corresponded to how many universities wanted to make some improvements in that area. So I wonder whether that corresponds to what we were thinking and what we were typing into the chat window. So number 14 turned up in your chat contributions, which was interactivity, and that is actually the one which is coming out the strongest here from the areas where people wanted to make improvements. And then the next one down is actually number 1, which is about strategy. So that did turn up from a few folk in your chat contributions. And actually, that's something that it may not be that apparent to you as students, although I imagine it's part of your course that you're studying, that actually planning what a university is going to do in this area is really important. And then other ones that are on all sort of, they're all on number 7 level. So integrated systems, number 4. And then academic communities, so that's about the online community, that's in the turquoise there. And then down the bottom in the blue colour, that's academic community. So going down again to the blue colour was workload management of staff. So you did mention that, and that is an important area because it's not easy to develop good online learning, and it does take quite a lot of time. And historically, universities have not allocated that time to their staff. So we have a question: is number 21 an important benchmark if no institution worked on it? 21.
That's performance management, and that's a good question. And in fact, this whole area of course delivery, the sort of technical infrastructure, reliability, security, performance monitoring, are the sorts of areas which were very important going back a few years, I think, and have but increasingly universities just seem to be on top of that. You know, it's sort of business as usual, and they know how to do it, and they know how to do it well. So you're probably right that these are becoming benchmarks that are not that important anymore because you know, everyone can meet it. There are some other ones in that general area, which this one is a range of e-learning tools. And so actually often institutions do say, okay, now we've got a learning management system, we have a virtual learning environment, but actually it's a bit limited in various ways. And so so the emphasis, I think, has switched to looking in detail about how the virtual learning environment, learning management system actually appears to students and what teachers can do with it. But yeah, it works basically.
Yeah, that's linked to my comment of my own experience of doing these assessments, where the infrastructure, the technical infrastructure is really very good. So the fact that there's no actions against that benchmark, I assume everybody judged it to be, you know, very high quality, which it was. Okay, so we'll just move through and finish this case study. So that's just a quick summary, really, of the findings from here. So it's the same graph that you saw on the previous slide. So it's identifying that the e-learning strategy is important. The online academic communities aspects is important. That was what we were discussing earlier in relation to social media. Interactivity, people are planning to make that better, really. They didn't tend to judge it as being a particular problem, as in it wasn't poor in their view, but their ambition was to make it better, and to have better tools available. And then we've spoken already about staff workload management, which is very important. Anything else, John, from you?
No, I think that captures it. We have another question there. Which benchmark is very specific for a technological environment? Good question. All of this is E-xcellence is all about e-learning, so it's all the technology underpins everything. but it does allow blended learning as well.
Let's go backwards. I think we've gone on to the wrong slide there. Let's just go back.
I think it was really just to.
Oh, did you mean to take
No,
it
I
back?
didn't, but,
No.
but maybe Fen did.
Oh.
But it gives us the summary there of
I see, right.
all the
Yeah.
benchmarks.
Yeah.
So the sort of course delivery ones are the most obviously technological, but actually course design, given that the focus is on e-learning, it's always about the e-learning aspects of that. So that's in there. And equally, the staff support and student support, they're general issues for all staff, all students in any institution, whether they're doing e-learning or face-to-face learning or blended learning. But E-xcellence is always about looking at the technological aspects, about the online aspects of it. So that's where the focus is always in that area.
Yeah. I think that there is something I'd say in response to Sarah's question there. So increasingly these days, and you're all aware of this, I'm sure, there's concern about security and privacy. So number 20 would have, concerns about keeping students' data secure and safe from hackers, and making sure there was no personal information available to other people where it shouldn't be. So probably that's the one I would highlight for being key at the moment. Okay.
There was an earlier question which we've missed in the chat window, which was about are there cases where you can't use E-xcellence? And I think maybe it's worth just mentioning that. Well, just to say that E-xcellence is designed to focus on online learning. That's where it started, and it was really designed as a way of complementing existing quality assurance that was designed for face-to-face situations, and that was often not that appropriate for e-learning. So there were countries, for example, that required to be accredited properly particular staff-student ratios, which were designed for face-to-face teaching and don't work for online. The number of lecture rooms, the amount of square meters of classroom space and so on, all completely inappropriate for online learning. So that was one of the reasons E-xcellence came about. It has, I think, broadened in scope to cover institutions which are doing blended learning, where there's a mix of online learning and face-to-face teaching. So one answer is E-xcellence would not be appropriate for a course which is very largely taught face-to-face. It wouldn't really be that helpful. But another answer is actually it's really useful stuff, because it covers a very broad aspect of learning generally and makes you think about things. So I wouldn't say that an institution should pick it unless they're doing teaching with a large proportion of online learning, but actually as a less formal way of doing it, an informal approach, reading the manual and thinking about what it means to your own practice as a teacher, for example, I think would be really useful to anyone.
Do you want to say, are we nearly out of time?
I think we are really
out of time. It might be worth making a few comments about MOOCs without doing all that, and because you have applied this principled framework to the situation of MOOCs, haven't you? Yes. So I don't want to go through the whole thing because it would take us too long, but let me just quickly move to a couple of slides to say about MOOC quality particularly. Has been an aspect of e-learning where people over the last few years were quite concerned about the quality of MOOCs. And so we have adapted E-xcellence into something called the Open Up Ed quality label, which is derived from E-xcellence, but takes a lighter weight process of it to make it easier to apply. And it has some particular features
one of which is essentially using the E-xcellence benchmarks, but just for the platform of the institution. But you only do that occasionally. So they're the things that we've covered already. And then for a particular course, has a limited number of benchmarks that can be looked at. So the approach is very similar. So here are some course level benchmarks. These are the ones that you should look at for an individual course. So it's not as complicated. It's not such a complex process to go through as E-xcellence, but it should cover the same grounds, a little bit tailored to MOOCs particularly, and an approach to MOOCs which had some additional features as well, like being very open to learners, digital openness, which has to do with licensing approaches and so on, taking a very learner-centered approach, and being open to a spectrum of diversity. So there are some additional qualities that have been associated with it. So that's all I want to say about it, because otherwise I could be here for another hour, which I don't think would be appropriate. So Jan has given us a question. What would you say is the strongest feature of E-xcellence in comparison to other systems? I always come back to, and I think the experience of other reviewers is this focus on quality enhancement as opposed to an accreditation or a standards meeting approach. So it's and which reflects on some of the questions we've had. You know, can an excellent institution that's already excellent do better? And I think E-xcellence really supports that idea of wherever you are, you can do better, and wherever you are, you should be rewarded for doing as good as you've got. And also, institutions can be very different. The students within them can be very different. So a sort of national or European standard, it doesn't always work. It's about meeting the needs of a particular institution, particular students in a particular context. And E-xcellence, I think, is very good at supporting that. And I think that's one of its strong points.
I think I completely agree with that. Having dealt with quality processes within this university, which do, you know, sometimes you feel they're not being very helpful. My judgment of the E-xcellence label is that it always is helpful. But the main thing I like about it is the fact that you've got a whole different set of people in the self-assessment team at the university. So you will get the vice chancellor, you will get a selection of teachers, you'll get some students, you'll get some people who run the VLE. You see all of it, and you make sure that all of it is right. And those people are actually working together as a team, a multidisciplinary team. So in that respect, I think it's really, really very good indeed.
So another question, you don't include student performance in the assessments? No, in terms of how many, you know, reach a distinction or something, no, we wouldn't be looking at that. The institution itself might be using that as part of the evidence that they present, but there's no reason to think that we should look at that. But remember that E-xcellence is part of and complements the things that the university would be doing anyway, and they certainly would be looking at that.
And that's done through, it's more the process. So in a sense, that is assessed, in that we need to be clear that other people are involved in, you know, in the review. So the people in the university are looking at that themselves, and that if they judge that they need external people to look at it, then they do that. So it's more to look at the processes, the quality processes that there are, rather than any numbers that come out, if you like. When is an enhancement considered good enough? It's the judgment of the reviewers, really, the expert reviewers.
And they recommend to EADTU, and finally it's the council of EADTU that would make a decision if there's any issue. But it's really an acknowledgement of a willingness of the institution to improve. So again, good enough is a difficult thing to say.
So can I just chip in?
Yeah.
So a number of the reviews that John and I have been involved with, we would receive a roadmap from the university, having looked at the quick scan and so forth. And then we would discuss it with our fellow reviewers. And if we felt there were things that needed to be strengthened, then we would say that to the university, and they would need to come up with a second version of that roadmap to get the label.
There's a good question at the end, is how important is it to have the label? Do people already expect institutions to have it? Frankly, no. I think it has been important to some institutions, particularly those that are moving from a traditional face-to-face delivery and taking their first steps into online learning. I think it has helped them in a sort of public way of getting the label, but actually it's also helped them as part of their enhancement process. So by setting out to say, actually, we need this, it drives an internal process to improve, and that's what's important. And once they're confident themselves that they're doing well, then maybe achieving the label then is no longer important. So certainly we've had institutions that have done it for 2 or 3 iterations, but maybe won't continue it forever. Yeah, I would like every institution in Europe to have it, and the reality is nothing like that, I'm afraid.
Okay, right. Well, thank you very much for being so active and asking really interesting questions and putting in your big range of views. So from just 9 or 10 people, that's been a great session, I think. So thanks.
Okay, thanks, John and Karen. I think we had a great session, and I want to thank you very much for it.
Okay, you're welcome.
I think we have to close now, but we will send you a message later. Is that okay?
Okay, right. Bye.
Great.
Bye.
Bye.
Oké, een paar reflecties.
Als ik het grote doe.